The first thing I heard on the day, I finally became a homeowner was and oppos. The sound of the wind through the ancient oaks or the satisfying click of a key in a brand new lock. No, it was a woman's voice, sharp and jagged, ripping through the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon like a chainsaw through silk. End quote. You can't live here, end quote. She screamed, and I remember standing there on my gravel driveway, key fob still warm in my palm, looking around to see who on earth she was talking to because surely it couldn't and oppos. Be me. I just spent 10 years eating ramen and working double shifts in a windowless IT basement for this moment. And here was this stranger in a pastel polo shirt, sprinting across the street with the intensity of a linebacker, finger pointed right at my chest, as if I just set her flower bed on fire. My name's Caleb, and I'm the kind of guy who avoids conflict at all costs. The guy who apologizes to the table when I stub my toe, but as this woman planted herself at my bumper, eyes wide and vibrating with a frequency I can only describe as, in quote, unhinged, end quote, I felt that first little spark of something new. Beside me, my wife Sarah was still holding a box of kitchen supplies, her face frozen in that look of confused, polite Canadianness she gets when things go sideways. And for a second, we just stood there. End quote. Mon oppos. End quote. I said, trying to keep my voice in that low, soothing register you use for startled animals or crashing servers, end quote. I literally closed on this house 2 hours ago. I think there's been a misunderstanding, end quote, but she didn't oppose. T wanted a conversation. She wanted a conquest because she just leaned in, her breath smelling faintly of expensive peppermint and pure, concentrated ego, and whispered, end quote. This house belongs to the Blackwood Estates heritage. You've made a catastrophic mistake, and if you don and oppose, T leave now, I will make sure the city eats you alive. End quote. See, we've been searching for a place for 6 months in a market that felt like a bloodbath, getting outbid by faceless corporations and cash buyers who didn't and oppose. To even care about the floorboards or the way the light hit the breakfast nook at 7 a.m. When this sprawling, slightly weathered Victorian on the edge of Silver Creek popped up for 30% on a market value. We didn't and oppose. T asked why. We just jumped, thinking we'd finally caught a break from the universe. The seller was a frantic-looking guy who seemed like he was running from a ghost. And the title was clean, the lot lines were clear, and the yard was shaded by these massive, century-old maples that felt like they were guarding the place. What we didn't oppose, T realized, was that the ghost the seller was running from was currently standing on our lawn, introducing herself as Meredith Thorne, the end quote, Grand Matriarch, end quote, and acting president of the Blackwood Homeowners Association. End quote. Meredith, right? End quote. I said, pulling a manila folder from the front seat because being an IT guy, I'd don and oppose. T go anywhere without documentation. End quote. I checked the covenants. This parcel, the old Miller estate, it was never annexed into Blackwood. It predates your HOA by nearly 20 years. So technically, I'm your neighbor, but I'm not your subject, end quote. I tried to offer a smile, a peace offering of sorts, but she looked at the county map I held out like it was a piece of used tissue paper, her jaw flexing so hard I thought her teeth might crack. End quote. Maps are just opinions on paper, Mr. Sterling, end quote. She said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm simmer, end quote. But influence, well, influence is reality, and you'll find that in this cul-de-sac, my reality is the only one that matters, end quote. She didn't and oppose. T wait for a reply. She just turned on her heel, pulled out a gold-plated iPhone, and started barking orders for an end quote. Emergency board quorum, end quote, on her front lawn, and as I watched 3 luxury SUVs pull in her driveway. 5 minutes later, I realized Sarah was right. We should have bought a security camera before we bought a sofa. The next few days were a blur of, end quote, weaponized bureaucracy, end quote, that I didn't and oppose to even know was possible in a free country. It started with a pink slip on my door at 6 a.m. for, end quote, improper waste vessel orientation, end quote, which is a fancy way of saying my trash can was tilted 2 inches to the left, and then came the notice for, end quote, unauthorized organic debris, end quote, because a few leaves from those beautiful maples had dared to fall onto the sidewalk. I called the city, thinking surely some reasonable person would see the absurdity, but the woman on the other end of the line just sighed when I gave her my address, a long, weary sound that told me I wasn't into oppos. T, the first person to call about 42 Willow Lane. End quote. Look, Caleb, end quote. She whispered, her voice dropping as if she were sharing state secrets, end quote. I'm not supposed to say this, but appeal everything, take photos of everything, and for the love of God, Don and oppos. T, let her see you sweat because Meredith Thorne has a way of making people disappear from that neighborhood. End quote. I spent my first week as a homeowner not painting the nursery or unpacking my books, but sitting in the dark of my living room, watching my new 4K doorbell feed like it was a thriller movie. I caught Meredith at 4:30 in the morning, dressed in a silk robe, using a literal yardstick to measure the height of my grass, scribbling furiously on a clipboard while her breath misted in the cold air. I saw her coaching a younger couple from down the street, pointing at my windows and nodding, as if she were teaching a class on how to spot a criminal in the wild. It felt like we were being besieged. Sarah started jumping every time the mail slot clattered, and I found myself grinding my teeth so hard at night that my head throbbed. But then the first anonymous text arrived. She's done this to 4 families in 3 years. Look into the Briarwood Trust. Don and oppos. T, give up your dirt. That text was the spark that turned my frustration into a cold, calculated fire. Because if there's one thing an IT guy knows how to do, it's dig through data until the skeletons start rattling. I spent my nights submerged in public records, chasing paper trails through shell companies and hidden liens, and what I found made my blood run cold. Meredith wasn't into oppos. T, just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a predator, a woman who used the HOA like a garrote to strangle homeowners into submission. She'd target the vulnerable, a widower with a failing heart, a family underwater on their mortgage, an elderly woman whose memory was slipping, and she'd bury them in fines and legal fees until they broke. And every single time, a group called the Briarwood Trust would swoop in to, end quote, rescue, end quote, them by buying the house for pennies on the dollar, only to flip it for a massive profit or turn it into a high-end rental. I found one of those former owners, a man named Elias, who was now living in a cramped apartment on the other side of town, and when I mentioned Meredith's name, he started shaking so hard he had to set his coffee down. End quote. She told me I was a blight, end quote. He whispered, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory, end quote. She sent inspectors to my door every Friday like clockwork. They found things wrong with my foundation that didn't into oppos to even exist, and I couldn't in oppos T fight anymore. I just wanted to sleep without dreaming of orange violation stickers, end quote. That was the moment I realized this wasn't into oppos T about grass height or, end quote, neighborhood character, end quote. It was about a woman who had turned her ego into a business model, and she had decided that I was the next lamb to be slaughtered. But Meredith made one fatal mistake. She assumed that because I was quiet and worked in tech, I was soft, but she didn't into oppos. T realized that I'm the guy people call when the system breaks, and I know exactly how to find a glitch. She tried to deliver the killing blow on a Thursday, a legal summons for a temporary restraining order claiming that I had, end quote, threatened her with physical violence, end quote, and was a, end quote, danger to the community's safety, end quote. It was a brilliant, disgusting move because a judge could have barred me from my own property for weeks while things were, end quote, sorted out, end quote. Giving her the window, she needed a pile on more pressure. When we walked into that courtroom, Meredith was a masterpiece of performative victimhood, wearing a modest gray suit and dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, telling the judge how she, end quote, feared for the sanctity of her quiet street, end quote, because of my, end quote, aggressive outbursts, end quote. Her lawyer, shark in a $3,000 suit, stood up and played a series of clips from Meredith's own security cameras, clips that had been surgically edited to show me stepping toward her, looking frustrated, my mouth moving in what looked like a shout. For a second, the room felt heavy, and I saw the judge's expression harden. But then my attorney, a woman named Julianne, who looked like she ate shark for breakfast, stood up and pulled out a laptop. End quote, Your Honor, end quote, she said, her voice echoing with a calm authority that made Meredith's lawyer flinch, end quote. We'd like to provide the end oppos, director's cut and oppos, of those events captured by my client's 360-degree high-definition security system, end quote. The screen flickered to life, and the courtroom watched in dead silence as the full video played, showing Meredith not as a victim, but as the aggressor. We saw her crossing my property line by 10 feet, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush, and we heard her clearly coaching a neighbor, saying, in quote, "If you want that new part put in, you'll tell the police he lunged at you, do you understand?" End quote. But the real dagger was the metadata. I had spent 48 hours straight tracing the IP addresses of the city inspectors who had been hounding me, and Julianne dropped a stack of photos on the judge's desk. Clear, time-stamped shots of Meredith handing a thick, unmarked envelope to a senior city code official at a nondescript diner 3 towns over. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. The judge didn't and oppose. T just denied the restraining order. He vacated it with a prejudice that felt like a lightning strike, and then he leaned over the bench, his face a mask of controlled fury, and suggested that the district attorney might be very interested in Meredith's, in quote, charitable contributions, in quote, to public officials. As we walked out of that courtroom, Meredith didn't and oppose. She looked like a matriarch anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, her carefully coiffed hair starting to fray, her eyes darting around as if searching for an exit that didn't and oppose exist. The fallout was a beautiful, chaotic domino effect. Word spread through the neighborhood like a wildfire, and suddenly the, end quote, quiet shame, end quote, that Meredith had used to isolate her victims turned into a collective roar. We held an emergency meeting in my backyard, the yard she told me I couldn't and oppose stand in, and 30 people showed up, people who had been living in fear for years, clutching their own binders of fines and letters. We voted to dissolve the current board, and when the tally came in 42-1, the look on Meredith's face as she watched her kingdom crumble was better than any sunset I've ever seen. Her husband, a man who looked like he'd been holding his breath for 20 years, ended up cooperating with the investigation, revealing that the, and quote, Briarwood Trust, end quote, was little more than a money-laundering front for Meredith's personal ambitions. A month later, I was sitting on my porch, finally watering that elderflower bush Sarah had wanted, when a man walked up the driveway. It was Marcus, the guy who had been sending me the anonymous texts. He didn't oppose. He wanted a medal. He just wanted to see the Maples one last time. And quote, my aunt lived here, end quote. He told me, his voice thick with a decade of repressed grief, end quote. And Meredith Thorne broke her heart until she just gave up. I've been waiting for someone with enough and oppose, nerd rage and oppose, to actually fight back. End quote. We sat there in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and for the first time, the air felt clean. So, here's what I've learned. Sometimes the loudest person in the room is only loud because they're terrified of someone finally saying, end quote, no, end quote, order ISN and oppose. The same as justice. And a community ISN and oppose. A brand you protect. It's a group of people you care for. Meredith ended up moving 2 states away, but I hear she's already trying to join a school board. As for us, we're still here. Our grass is probably an inch too high, and our trash cans are definitely tilted the wrong way. But every time I look at those maples, I'm reminded that some things are worth a mess. But I have to ask you, if you found out you're, in quote, perfect, in quote, neighborhood was built on a foundation of bullying and backroom deals, would you keep your head down to protect your property value, or would you risk everything to burn the system down? Is there a line where, in quote, keeping things nice, in quote, just becomes a mask for being a monster? Let me know in the comments, because I'm still here, still labeling my tabs, and I'm curious to know if you think I went too far, or if I didn't in oppose. To go far enough.